Before we get into this video, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Masked Writer Chris for submitting this story. The story is titled, I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement. There's something down there. The apartment my family, me, my parents, and my little sister spent my childhood and teenage years in was a big red brick monster. It had a basement 3 stories below our apartment that was stifling in the summertime and frigid in the winter. If I'd had my way, I would have had a drum kit down there to jam on, but the neighbors would have killed us, even though we got along just fine with them, except for the people who lived downstairs from us, a mother and daughter. The mother had to have been in her 60s. The daughter was grown but still living at home. The daughter was nice. My sister and I got along with her. It was the mother who was the problem. It was always something with her mother, who was loud, seemingly always angry sort. We often heard their vicious arguments coming up in angry metallic ghost whispers through our radiator pipes at night. We couldn't usually make out what they were saying, but boy, were they mad about something. It always got back to us that she talked trash about us behind our backs, and she always gave us stink eyes whenever we met in person. Both our parents worked, and we kids were usually left to ourselves, but we were always told one thing very firmly by both our parents. Do not go into the basement unsupervised. We just looked at them, nodded and smiled, and left it at that. Something about how the old lady downstairs didn't want us in there, and given how mean she was, we listened. We didn't like her either, so it worked for us. The summer I turned 18, however, I got into my head that I was grown and I could do whatever I wanted to. Besides, who cared what an old bat downstairs thought anyway? She was obviously crazy. I decided I was going to see what the big deal was about. One humid summer Friday in mid-July, when the folks were off at work and my sister was out with her friends, I went for it. I slowly unlocked the kitchen's back door that led downstairs to the basement, pausing only to stifle the years of conditioning in the back of my mind. I took in the worn and faded black and white kitchen floor, the sunlight streaming through the window, the natural white appliances around me. I hung on these prosaic images for some odd reason. It was like something was telling me to enjoy these things while I still could, because something huge was about to happen. Something life-altering even. After a couple of moments, I shook my head and scoffed, as though the Metallica t-shirt I had worn would protect me from whatever might be down there. Needless to say, I wasn't thinking deeply. I slowly descended the old wooden stairs to the basement, moving quietly with my hand on the banister. Apprehension slowly built in my gut as I got lower and closer to the wooden basement door. It had cracking old white paint, a deadbolt, a wired window in the top half, and slightly rusted hinges. A really determined attacker would have likely kicked it in with moderate effort. I paused, feeling my body hair tingle, then I ever so gently undid the deadbolt and eased it open. The basement had a concrete floor with a series of wood-slat storage cubicles along the walls. Sunlight from outside dappled the slats with mellow gold, as dust and musty scent of concrete tickled my nose. There wasn't much here other than a couple of 10-speed bicycles that looked like they'd not been used in some time. Without warning, I let one rip with a whopper of a sneeze from all the dust. My sneezes are not quiet, and I usually muffle them, but since I was by myself, I let rip. A faint shuffling noise came from nearby, and my heart nearly stopped as I spun to see who it was, but there was no one there with me. Nobody that I could see anyway. I thought I heard a soft hissing, and that was enough for me to get out of there quickly. I quietly slunk upstairs to the safety of our apartment and retreated to my room to crank my stereo. A good dose of Motorhead always cured what ailed me, and Dr. Rock soon had me headbanging joyfully. When my sister got home, she stuck her head into my room and rolled her eyes at her hopelessly uncool big brother antics. It wasn't until I flagged her down that she stopped. She knew I was serious when I actually stopped the record player to talk to her. The look on her face when I told her what I was doing was priceless, because it was such a perfect look of shock. Mind you, we got along well enough. She was, however, at the age where it was mandated she acted otherwise in public. Naturally, She had a clean-cut jock boyfriend with a bright future in football. Never mind that a deaf man could hear how fake he was when sucking up to her parents. Of course, he thought I was a loser with questionable sexuality. At age 16, she was their bright star of hope, and I'd be lying if I said she didn't work that angle at times to her full advantage. Unlike me, who aspired to be the next Lemmy Kilmister, to conquer the world armed with a bass guitar slung around my neck. Never mind the fact that I was a straight arrow whose worst traits were his long hair and band t-shirt collection. Never mind that I used music as a means of staying out of trouble, and I was effectively straight edge. Never mind that I had good grades and was considering music college, to my parents' dismay. My being helplessly unpopular with the girls didn't help matters. I was the screw-up in their eyes. But that's neither here nor there. My sister stared at me in shock, then sputtered out, "Are you serious? You actually went down there? What did you see?" I told her and she seemed disappointed at first. Inevitably, it came down to, "You're not going down there again, are you? I won't tell on you, but come on. You don't know what's down there. It could be anything." When I told her I was going to, she sighed and said, "I don't know nothing. I still think you need to stay out of there," but she trailed off and left my room shaking her head. I went to bed that night with my mind whirling. I was keen to see how much further I could push it. My youthful arrogance totally shut down anything resembling common sense. As soon as our parents were out grocery shopping, and my sister was out with a boyfriend, I quietly headed down to the basement again. I was doing my best to ignore the Ramones song playing in the back of my head about how I didn't want to go down there all the while. Once again, I silently walked into the huge sunny open area of the basement. I felt my tension and my nervousness ratchet up as I heard a soft shuffling nearby. I traced it to one of the storage closets, which had a large, heavy new padlock on the door. Was there something, or even someone, in there? Screwing up my courage to the max, I took a peek through the slats. I could have sworn I saw something move in there. I drew back with a stifled gasp and hurried out to safety, light, and normal life. Sunday, the day after, I had to stay around due to everyone being home, but I swore that the following day, I'd try to take things even further. If there was someone living down there, what the heck were they doing there? What was up with the lock on the door? Why was that person locked in there? Did I want to know? My diet of cheesy, gory horror movies made all kinds of ideas brew in my mind as to who or what it could be. All of which I thought were alternatively crazy or totally awesome at the same time. Did we have our very own suburban equivalent of Stuart Gordon's Castle Freak down in our basement? Sunday dragged on and no amount of playing records or playing the bass helped time go by. I went to bed full of anticipation, excitement, and increasing confidence. I could do this, I kept telling myself. I could take a closer look at the basement's weird inhabitant, with nobody the wiser. Right? Right. When I finally fell asleep, I had creepy dreams all night that ultimately woke me up with a stifled cry. I barely remembered that particular dream, but what jerked me awake was a creepy, high-pitched, distorted voice, saying something like, "Mommy?" For some reason, I couldn't tell you why, that woke me up shivering. I don't scare easily, too, at least not from horror movies. I can handle that because I know that they're not real. I could handle gore effects for days in movies because they were so over the top. I could laugh about them afterwards and say, dude, that was sick, but something about this dream made me stay frozen in bed, even though I had to pee badly. There was something especially freaky and out of place about it. It seemed like someone had been right by my ear saying it. Finally, my aching bladder forced me up, and after taking care of business, it took me some time to get back to sleep. By the time I woke up again, it was nearly 11 a.m. The parents were at work, of course. My sister always kept her doors closed, but I didn't hear her snoring after a minute of listening. The dream was only a faint memory as I unlocked and opened the back door to head downstairs. Only this time I was surprised to see the door to the basement itself was unlocked. That's weird, I thought as I slowly opened it and slipped into the area, only to be greeted by the downstairs crazy neighbor lady. It would have to be her, right? Almost as soon as I turned around, she was in my face and all over me. "What are you doing here? Get out! You didn't see anything." Her voice was its usual harsh, angry bray, but was desperation I also heard. She was tall, thin, had bushy, copper-colored hair that was obviously dyed, and big, thick glasses. She wore ugly floor-length house dresses most of the time and was not the prettiest woman out there. Then again, she was always glaring and frowning. As we stood there, me standing in shock and her snarling at me, I noticed two things. One, she had a sack in her hand that had spots of red on it. Wet red spots. Two, I suddenly heard a sound from the corner of the room. It was a wordless whimper that made my hair stand on end. A frantic banging noise started up from where the closets were. As that happened, she had a brief moment of panic. Very brief. Then she stepped up to me and snarled, "You don't know nothing, got it?" At that point, my teenage flash left me. I gave a quick nod, turned, and rushed out as she closed the door behind me. But just because I didn't sass her, didn't mean I went away immediately. I crept up to the door and put my ear to it, and heard her doing something I'd never heard before. She was talking to somebody in something other than a working tone of a voice. She actually sounded sweet and loving, of all things. I couldn't make out all what she was saying, but it sounded something like, "I'm so sorry, sweetie. The bad boy's gone now. It's just you and me now, sweetie. Mommy loves you." What made me pull away with a shudder was the noise that greeted her. That same weird voice that made me shiver. It sounded like a really big cat, or even worse in this case, a person imitating a cat. What the heck was going on in there, involving her and whoever or whatever it was? And what had been in that sack? I knew bloodstains when I saw them, believe me. The thoughts that raced through my mind were hysterical as I quickly tiptoed back into the kitchen and retreated to my room again. This had to be something that our neighbor had kept hidden for a really long time, because this had been going on for as long as we'd lived there. As in, since my sister and I were in single-digit ages. She must have had some serious pull with the landlord to keep this a secret for this long. Why else would she have been scared of letting anybody else know about whatever was down there? But my limited real-life experience was soon eclipsed by me being a horror movie buff. I was soon coming up with all kinds of ideas as to what or who was in our apartment building's basement, all of which were cast off as fast as I thought them up. I flopped down on my bed with an exasperated sigh as my brain ached from it. I needed to see more. I had to find out once and for all just what was in that closet, no matter what the crazy old man had to say about it. She couldn't be home all the time, right? Unless maybe she never left home for just this reason. One way to find out, I firmly decided. Even after another night of scary dreams that woke me often, I went back downstairs to the basement once I was alone that following day. I was deranged from a lack of sleep and driven by something in my mind, compelling me into who knows what. The next thing I knew, I was making my way to the little closet in the corner. I didn't hear anything this time, but I still slowed down as I got closer and closer to it. My heart was pounding hard enough that I thought whatever was in there could probably hear it clearly. I paused in front of the door, breath catching in my throat, my ribs vibrating with every heartbeat as I peered between the slats. I glimpsed something pale, lying still, and I also smelled feces and urine. It smelled like something had crawled up someone's butt and died. I saw what looked like someone's back turned towards me, with vertebrae poking through to an unhealthy degree, someone's skin and bones. I gasped, and the next thing I knew, a pair of jaundiced eyes were staring into mine. My terror was intense as I heard the same weird voice I'd been hearing in my dreams, but I didn't run this time. It sounded both puzzled and sad as it said, "Hello, friend?" I thought I'd known what loneliness was, being an outcast was, but I heard more loneliness and sadness in those two words than I'd ever known in my young, sad life. Something in the voice of this poor guy, thing, whatever it was, awakened sympathy in my heart. I finally found my own voice after a few seconds, stammering. Yeah, friend." I was nearly whispering in awe at what was happening.
"Yeah, friend. Good. Need friend."
I even felt tears stinging my eyes as it said what it said next.
I like friend.
Something in that voice just made me realize just how petty my feelings of being left out by my peers were in the grand scheme of things. Here I was with a good life in comparison. I got to come and go as I pleased. I had food and clothes, records, a bass guitar, a room of my own and a roof over my head that wasn't a musty, bare concrete. This poor guy, I thought it was a guy anyways, didn't have any of that. I thought of Mary Shelley's Creature, and it hit me that this guy was a real outsider and an outcast. Some things just put life into perspective. "Hey man, what's your name?" I spoke quietly and gently, and took a moment to introduce myself properly.
Name?
It sounded uncertain. Yeah, you have a name, right? Everybody has a name." I was surprised when he repeated the same word, as though it was new for him. Did this guy not have a name? I thought for a second, then said, "Hey, can I call you Frank?" Short for Frankenstein, of course, knowing full well, as a movie buff, that was the doctor's name, not the creature. Hey, it was the first thing that came to my mind.
Frank. Yes, I like Frank.
That weird voice came through the wood. I found myself smiling in spite of myself, because whoever this guy was, he didn't seem all bad. He just wanted someone to talk to. I knew how that felt, and found myself feeling sorry for him. It hit me right then, though, that I best get back upstairs before I was caught again. "Listen, Frank, I gotta go now, but want me to come back and visit you again? Is that okay?" Frank's voice cracked with emotion as he replied to me.
Yes! Please, come back.
I forced a lump out of my throat before I could speak. "I will, man. See you again soon, Frank. Don't tell anybody I was here, okay? I'm kinda not supposed to be here."
Okay,
Frank said, sounding happy. I quietly left the gloomy interior and listened a moment to make sure that that crazy lady wasn't approaching. I made it back upstairs with no incident this time. Back in my room, it hit me that this was something big. I knew that this was something I had to keep to myself, even if it meant that poor Frank only had one friend in the world and was stuck in there. I didn't want anybody else to know about this. Heck, I was surprised that the crazy old bat hadn't gone stomping to my parents to scream at them about me. So much as I wanted to dangle this on my sister's face, I decided to stay quiet about this development. The next couple of weeks were interesting, to say the least. The days I got to spend time with Frank were marked by me being amazed at how naive about the real world he really was. Talking to him was like talking to an overgrown toddler sometimes. But he was eager to listen, so I cut him all the slack. I told him about music, about girls, about pretty much everything I could think of. He eagerly listened to me, and it was gratifying. I had a couple of close calls with the crazy lady, but on both occasions I had legitimate reasons to be down there. As in taking out the trash and stuff. She threw me the stink eye on both occasions, and I threw attitude back at her, because I was getting pretty ticked off. You see, apparently she was his mother, and judging from what little Frank told me about her, she was crappy to him. Mind you, he had no idea about, birds and the bees. He just knew that she was his mother. He implied that she talked down to him and kept him in the state of arrested development for God only knew the reasons on her end. He also said she often slapped him around and screamed at him, and he couldn't fathom why. I started getting angrier about it over time. Because us young headbangers are rebellious, and we hate the idea of our freedom being infringed on, which means we don't want that to happen to our friends and our loved ones either. He had no idea who his father was, but he mentioned having awful dreams about something watching him that scared him badly. Something that didn't sound normal or natural at all, based on what little he told me. This made me think God only knows why. Was his father even human? Part of me thought he'd had to have been, because who would want to get with her? As soon as the thought crossed my mind, a shiver went up and down my spine, and I put it aside instantly. But it kept coming back to haunt me at the worst times. It made me feel like I knew something that I was never meant to know about. Every time I thought about it, I gave up in short order because of how creeped out and jittery it made me feel. The nightmares grew worse and more frequent over time, too. I didn't let it get in the way of my regular visits with Frank, though. I was able to lose myself in how happy he was to know that I was there. I had no idea what I could do to help him, but I had to do something. But what exactly? That drove me nuts. I had no idea of what was about to hit the fan that one particular morning. I woke up from one of my worst nightmares yet that involved sharp teeth, blood everywhere, and Frank screeching in rage. As usual, I went downstairs when I was alone. On the way down there, mayhem broke out in the basement. I heard the crazy lady ranting and blows landing. When I got to the door, I shuddered when I heard a heartbreaking whimpering responding to her angry voice. "Frank!" I then heard the part that made me see red. "You weren't even supposed to exist. You don't even have friends. Who the heck would want to be your friend, you sorry freak? I hate you enough as it is." That was it. I heard enough. The next thing I knew, I was running across the basement. I saw her standing in the doorway of the cubicle beating on Frank, and I went berserk. I was able to grab her arm and violently drag her away. I was yelling at her to leave him alone, and the look of shock on her face was satisfying. At first, she was off balance and I pulled her away, but then she was screaming back. Then she started wailing on me. She could hit too. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't having it. I fought back, dragging her further away from the cubicle and weathering her blows as best as I could. This was satisfying because it showed me that she wasn't so frightening after all when someone was fighting back, just like the bullies I dealt with in high school. Until something came up and clocked me on the side of the head hard. I didn't see what it was, but my head exploded and my vision was blurring. I struggled on blindly until whatever hit me hard hit me again, harder. I staggered and she beat me down, cursing me with every blow. It was one of those times I wish Dad hadn't been so thorough about teaching me to never hit a woman. An inhuman screech sounded in the background, cutting through my daze.
Leave him alone!
Suddenly, she had something else to worry about as she began screaming in pain. Not ow, I hit my head either. I heard Frank snarling like an angry animal as she babbled incoherently over the sounds of violent struggling. I then heard wet, ripping noises that made my stomach turn. Her screams reached a frenzied pinnacle and were cut off by a final tearing noise. I threw up hearing the sickening burble which followed that noise. When that died out and a final thud sounded, it got really quiet. I smelled a raw, coppery stench in the air that hit me in the back of my sinuses. I had a bad feeling I knew what it was. I didn't want to know. Unfortunately for me, my vision cleared up at that moment. I wish it hadn't. I looked up and saw it. It was crouching by the body of the crazy lady, who looked like she'd been through a meat grinder. She lay in a widening pool of thick, sticky red from her torn throat, her house dress ripped to shreds. Her face was frozen in terror, staring at the ceiling blankly. This wasn't a slasher movie, this was reality. It was no coincidence that I lost my taste for that kind of thing after this incident. But believe it or not, that's what terrified me the most. I heard a girl scream from nearby. Was that my sister? It looked up and let out a guttural hiss that sent whoever it was fleeing upstairs. It then turned its jaundiced, bulging yellow eyes onto me. Eyes I knew and a face only vaguely human. It had an unnaturally wide mouth that was now slathered with gore, a mouth full of way too many sharp teeth. There were prominent cheekbones, flabby lips, and a weak chin, all of it framed by long, greasy, straggly, dark hair. Everything about its lanky, bony body was just off. The eyes were too round, the mouth too wide, the arms too long, and there were what looked like withered fins on its arms and legs. There was even atrophied webbing between its long fingers and toes, both of which were tipped with long nails that looked too much like claws. Its skin was a pale white on the bottom, fading to an unhealthy yellow on its back and sides. What was this thing? I thought as it stood up, outlined in the sunlight from outside. Even worse, it smiled at me, or tried to anyways. Seeing that mouth trying to smile was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Even worse.
Friend. I like friend.
Goodness gracious, I knew that voice. Frank seemed happy to see me for the first time, until he realized his only friend was frightened of him. A second later, the most intense look of hatred I've ever seen on anyone's face took over. A look that made me scramble away from him as fast as I could. He glared down at the dead body of the crazy neighbor lady, gave an inhumanely high-pitched snarl, and started vigorously ripping into it. After what Frank had told me about the past treatment of him, and seeing it firsthand myself, this was definitely vengeance of a sort. I had to turn away my head as the smell of methane choked me. I could hear him growling and hissing as he proceeded to angrily tear her body apart limb from limb. This was the lonely outsider that I had reached out to over these last few months? This thing that was tearing apart and maybe even eating the body of his mother. Leave it me to befriend something that looked and acted like Gilman's long-lost cousin. What was I thinking? I dry-heaved as I heard a car pull up quickly outside. I heard my sister's voice frantically greeting whoever it was as heavy footsteps charged downstairs to the basement door. They stopped there and I heard a man's voice declare, "Oh my goodness." Frank looked up and snarled with blood dripping from that inhumane mouth. A second later, he was drowned by gunfire that was deafening in the enclosed space. I scrambled out of the way like a sensible person would, for once in my life. After what seemed like forever, the newcomers finally stopped shooting. I heard them swiftly reloading, heard slow dragging and slithering. I looked up to see Frank, shot full of holes, crawling towards me.
Sorry, friend.
I was overcome with grief for some reason when he said that. I'll never forget the sad look he gave me as a policeman moved in to finish him off with a point-blank headshot. Everything then became a blur as I went to shock. Or was I already there and finally noticing it? At that time, an overdue and merciful blackout hit me. I came to in a hospital bed with a headache from hell and feeling eerily calm. Sedatives and really good painkillers probably, I thought as I looked around and saw my family by my side. My parents were scared and worried, and even my sister's facade of snottiness was absent. They asked me what had happened down there, but I couldn't find the words to answer them. I just found myself staring at the ceiling in a daze. At that point, someone entered the room, and a man's voice quietly addressed my family. I heard them file out of the hospital room and close the door. After a moment's silence, the man addressed me. "I'm Agent Hopkins from the FBI. For all intents and purposes, that subject you saw down there does not exist. You did not see anything. Second, you were not to discuss it with anybody, not even your family. If you say you saw something to anybody, we'll know about it, and there will be damage control. Do you understand what I just told you?" His voice was flat, hard, and a matter of fact. The pauses in that spiel said all I needed to hear about how my life would be if I disregarded anything he said. Maybe it was the drugs in my system, but I just nodded. I let his words wash over me without any sarcasm or a wise guy demeanor on my end, because who would believe me anyway? People thought I was crazy and stupid already since I was a headbanger and a horror film fan. They'd probably just laugh in my face the way they always did if I told them anything about this incident. I finally took a look at him before he left. He was middle-aged, ordinary, gray hair, dark suit, pretty generic, really. But something about his eyes made me shiver, and I immediately turned away after a couple of seconds of looking at him. He walked silently out of the hospital room without fanfare, and the dead silence that followed was more deafening than any concert I've ever been to in the past. The sense of hopelessness I felt at his words were overpowering. As a good little headbanger kid thinking that I was anti-establishment, this day was what rammed it home for me about how pointless that attitude was when the establishment was like this. The people who could just casually swoop in and take away your life, your family, everything that mattered to you if you stepped out of line. Here this suit and tie guy was just expecting me just to get over it in a blink of an eye. No way, man. But the worst part of it was, even being young and stupid, I lost a friend. Weird and creepy though he'd been. If it hadn't been for his looks that had gotten him cooped up for his good, he might have had a chance at a normal life. My life was perfect in comparison, and this incident made me painfully aware how accurate that was. I knew that I'd never feel exactly the same about my life from now on. I was in the hospital overnight, then they released me with painkiller prescription and not much else. I couldn't help but feel that I was being shunted away. Home life wasn't much different, except my parents must have thought what happened had been punishment enough for me. but it also felt like they were walking on eggshells around me. Between that and the FBI guy verbally slapping me down the way he had, I was not a happy camper. It took me months to wrap my head around what had happened. Even then, I had a hard time dealing with it. After I got past the anger over the whole thing, I was seriously depressed for some time after that. That stupid therapist I had to go to didn't help at all. All he did was talk down to me, and that sucked hard. I didn't tell him about Jack either. Mom and Dad must have gotten a talking to from the FBI guy as well, because all they did was back off of me with their hands in the air, pretty much, and so it went. Then came the day when the crazy lady's daughter came to see me, and she told me she didn't hold anything against me. I heard her out since I had no problems with her. She told me that she'd argued with her mother numerous times about putting the poor guy out of his misery, since he was so deformed. But her mother always vehemently denied that option. Something about how it was her responsibility to take care of him, and immediately the memory of the way she'd been assaulting and screaming at Frank that day reoccurred. I told her what had happened, and it didn't exactly qualify as taking care of Frank. "I know," she said. Then she dropped the bomb. Her father had died when she was little, and she never knew who Frank's father really was. Only that her mother had gotten pregnant again after going away on several occasions with a group of creepy old people in dark clothing. She didn't remember much about them, but she did remember the night Frank was born. She remembered that her mother had given birth at home after a rough pregnancy, with the people in black overseeing the delivery. The screaming she'd heard from the bedroom that she'd been ejected from had scared her half to death. The noises of her little brother taking his first breaths had made her blood freeze, and she'd never forgotten her mother sobbing in horror as she screamed, "Oh my goodness, what have I done?" Frank had always been imprisoned in his room from day one. The first time she sneaked into his room to peek at him, she stopped at the cradle's side, stunned at what she saw. Her mother had tanned her hide for this, and she'd never done so again afterwards. It was so strange, haunting time. Her childhood had always been, and she'd left as soon as she came of age, but the creepy folks in black suddenly appeared and made it very clear that she was staying there, like it or not, for otherwise she'd be shrinking her duty, as they put it. She lacked the courage to stand up to these sinister strangers, and she was frightened that they'd come for her now for telling me anything. I blurted out, "Wouldn't they do that anyways now that Frank was dead?" That was usually how it happened in the movies anyways, that the bad guys would waste no time in eliminating those who had outlived their utility. "Oh, it will happen. They have ways of knowing things," she said with a shudder before excusing herself. I just sat there staring at my Metallica and Slayer poster for a while after that, to think that the cults like that existed in the real world. H.P. Lovecraft had been onto something, I thought, as implications sank into my brain. Then it hit me like a brick. Was that guy in the suit really FBI? I abruptly recalled that he didn't flash a badge of any kind. Was he one of those men in black I'd heard about on the internet? I went to bed full of tears and laying staring at the ceiling the way I had a habit of doing. Sleep? What was that? That was for normal people with families who actually loved and communicated with each other. At around 2 a.m., as I still laid there, stark awake, I suddenly heard through the radiator pipes, "Oh no, oh goodness, no! Leave me alone!" She started screaming and crying hysterically. I laid there shocked at what I was hearing, trying and failing to get up. My body felt numb, sluggish, but my brain was racing a mile a minute. I couldn't budge. An especially blood-curdling shriek through the radiator pipes, as bad as the crazy lady's final scream had been, broke the spell on me at last. I charged to our front door and unlocked it as fast as I could, then I hauled tail downstairs to the neighbor's doorstep. It didn't occur to me why my parents didn't even try to stop me, and I didn't care. I saw that her door was ajar and I banged through it into the living room of her apartment. The streetlights outside were just bright enough to illuminate the room. What I could make out in the dim of her living room rooted me to the spot, terrified. Then the stench hit me like a speeding truck, a stench of rotting fish and a human waste combined. My jaw dropped and my stomach churned as I took in everything before me. Several large figures were surrounding the crazy lady's daughter, whose pajamas had been partly torn off. She was on her knees staring up at the people around her. The people surrounding her were tall and gangly, and something wasn't right about them. As they turned to face me, I noticed their clumsy movements and the way their clothes were bulging as they looked my way. Unfortunately, my eyes had adjusted to the gloom, and holy crap, those faces looked more like fish than people. I saw wide mouths, bulging eyes, shark teeth, stringy hair just like Frank's. The deep croaks they let out at the sight of me made me shudder. As I stood there staring, I felt something hard pressed against the back of my skull. A familiar voice spoke from behind me.
"You should have stayed in bed, kid."
The men in black sounded even colder and more businesslike than he had in my hospital room. My heart jumped into my throat as the crazy lady's daughter let out a soft whine that said she'd been long since checked out from this scene.
"We'll have to change the story we've given the police and the media to accommodate for you."
"That's not important. The issue right now is, how did you manage to break the spell we've cast on this building?" He sounded a tiny bit baffled at that thought, but that didn't help. My legs were quivering and my brain was working overtime to try to figure out what I was going to do. He didn't give me time to come up with anything.
"Turn and look at me. It won't hurt. Much."
That was all it took to turn my bowels to water. Something crept in his voice that told me that his looking as ordinary as he did was for a reason.
"Don't be a hero. Mr. Glock would have something to say about that. Just look at me."
So was that it? All I had to do to get out of this was to look at his face? Couldn't be too bad, I thought in desperation. Of course, I was terrified over what might happen. Darn my overactive imagination. But if I could avoid catching a bolt in the head, I was all for it. Right? Right. Okay, I'll do that, I said. I wasn't able to keep my voice from quivering and the sounding too high-pitched. I slowly turned and heard a soft, menacing chuckle coming from him, which scared me even more. It sounded downright cruel. I thought I heard a noise, and even though I didn't know what it was, I had no choice, so I kept going, only to see something that shut my brain down instantly and hard. I came to in a fetal position. I was perfectly happy where I was, on the floor, safe and sound. Then, a memory jolted me to my feet, shooting a frightening glance all over. Oh my goodness. Was that still here? A flickering of undulating black tentacles whizzed past my mind's eye, and my brain reeled on its legs. The sun was up, lighting the living room on what would normally be a pretty autumn morning. Normally was the key word, because right away I saw something that made me freeze again. Eyes widening in horror. The crazy lady's daughter was sitting on the sofa, grinning idiotically. Her eyes were glassy and staring past me. I looked behind me and saw nothing, then slowly back at her. When we made eye contact, she twitched and I about jumped out of my skin. She looked right at me, and a hideous giggle came spilling from her mouth. A giggle that I found myself joining in with, because we both seen something not for human eyes or minds to comprehend. I found it just as funny as she did all of a sudden. Then it hit me hard. An image of writhing tentacles where a man's face should be that were so black that stood out in the dimness of that room assaulted my mind's eye. We kept giggling, which then turned into shrill laughter. I sat on the floor on the other side of the coffee table, pointing at her and laughing nonstop. At some point, it turned into both of us shrieking terribly. I'm not sure when, but that's how the guy in the white and the police found us when they arrived. I didn't resist when they carted me off. I was too busy laughing, sobbing, and trying to tell them what I'd seen, but the words just wouldn't come. The reason you're getting this story at all is because I'm writing it down on my cell here at the institution. I have mechanical pencils and I have snapped and gone through numerous leads committing to this paper. Papers I have kept well hidden, since someone might get cute and swipe them. The doctors were able to restore my mind, mostly. But even with the meds I've been given, I can't unsee what I saw. I can't remember the last time my family visited, and maybe that's for the better. I have a sneaking suspicion that maybe the men in black visited my family after he was done with me. I don't want to know what might have happened to the crazy lady's daughter. Did I mention I can't unsee the things I saw at the apartment complex? Even with the sleeping meds, the dreams come and they won't stop. I keep hearing the evil chuckle and that cold, flat voice telling me that I saw something I wasn't meant to see. No joke, Sherlock. It made me realize that yes, there really are things out there that we humans aren't meant to see or know about. We are better off being oblivious about them. I was no longer oblivious about this, now. I spare you the other things and the things I saw in my dreams. I was all too aware about their all too real world, now that lurks at the outskirts of the world we humans think is safe, good and solid. Heck no. The world we need to worry about is the one that we conveniently ignore, even though it's right under our noses. The world full of unspeakable things that will strike us raving mad if even a glimpse of them is caught by one of us humans. The dreams happen every night, and the worst part is, these sleeping meds are so strong that I can only wake when they finally wear off, after the eternity of every night on them. I can't not take them either. They make sure that I take them no matter what here. Even though these people mean well, they just don't get it. They nod, smile, and pat me on the head, but I can tell that they don't believe me. They're too busy thinking that I'm too crazy to know what I'm talking about. But I know better. I can't take it anymore. There's only one thing that will end this, I hope, though the Men in Black disagrees with me. In the dreamscapes, he opens up for me every night so he can torment me from wherever he is. He says it's a futile idea. I've smuggled a spoon from the dining hall and I've ground an impeccable point to the handle. As soon as I finish writing this, that point is getting rammed into my ear and into my brain so I can finally end this torture. Will I really be tormented by the Men in Black? Only one way to find out. If there's an afterlife, let's hope that it's well away from this world that they inhabit. It's bedtime